Welcome to Diana's Diaries, folks. I'm so glad you're here with me today. This is a place where we sit down, maybe with a cup of coffee, and share the stories that life hands us. Some warm and cozy, some a little harder to tell. I've got one for you now that's been rattling around in my heart for a while. Life's a funny thing, isn't it? One day you're moving along, everything as familiar as the creak of your front porch, and then, wham, something shifts, quiet at first, but before long it's stirring up your whole world. That's how it started for me one evening, right here in my little Tennessee town. I'm Diana, just an ordinary gal with a story to share. So, pull up a chair and let's step back to where it all began. I'm Diana, and I've lived most of my days in a snug house tucked up against the rolling hills of Tennessee. My husband, Robert, and I have been together for years, raised 2 kids who've been the light of our lives. Our place sits right by a stretch of woods, old oaks and pines that sway gentle in the wind. Sometimes, when I'm out there on my own, I'd swear those trees are whispering to each other, old tales from way back, secrets carried on the breeze. But I learned a while ago that the real mysteries aren't out there among the branches. They're closer than you'd think, hiding in the folks we hold dearest. It all started one cool fall evening when Henry, Robert's dad, rolled up to our doorstep. Henry's not one for frequent visits. He's been up in Kentucky for years, elbow deep in engine grease, fixing cars and keeping to himself. He'd called a few days before, said he'd be swinging by, but we didn't make much of it. Robert figured it'd be a quick hello, maybe a cup of coffee, and off he'd go. That night, I was the one to open the door, and the second I saw him standing there, something felt different. It wasn't anything big, no fireworks or thunder, just a little prickle, like a chill you can't explain. Henry's always been a quiet man, steady as the day is long, but there was a look in his eyes that caught me off guard. It was soft, sure, but deeper somehow, like he was carrying something he wasn't ready to say. He stepped inside, his boots scuffing the hardwood, and I waved him in with a smile. "Good to see you. Henry," I said, keeping it light. He nodded, tipped his old ball cap my way, and muttered a hello. Supper was already on the table, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, nothing fancy, and we settled in like always. Robert was chatting about the hardware store he runs in town. The kids were giggling over something silly, and I was passing the gravy. Henry sat across from me, quiet as ever, picking at his plate. It was all so normal, so every day, but I couldn't shake that little itch in the back of my mind. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking my way, not staring, just glancing, and it'd linger a beat too long. After we cleared the dishes, we drifted to the living room. The kids scampered upstairs to bed, and Robert stoked the fireplace, the logs snapping and popping. He launched into a story about a customer who'd bought half the store's nails for some big project, and I tried to listen, nodding along. But Henry was there, slumped in the armchair, and I could feel him, like a shadow you can't quite see. I told myself to quit being foolish. It was just Henry, same as always, but my eyes kept flicking his way. And every time he'd be looking back, his gaze steady and calm, but with something new simmering underneath. It wasn't loud or pushy, just there, tugging at me like a thread I didn't know I'd pulled. I shifted in my seat, smoothing my skirt, trying to shake it off. "You're imagining things, Diana," I scolded myself under my breath. Henry's been part of this family forever. Robert's dad, for heaven's sake. But that look of his, it wasn't just polite or tired. There was a weight to it, a question maybe, hiding behind that soft smile he always wore. I couldn't put my finger on it, and that made it worse. The room felt warm from the fire, but there was a chill creeping up my arms all the same. The night stretched on, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. Robert finished his story, yawned, and stretched his arms. "Reckon it's time to hit the hay," he said, standing up. I nodded, but as I got to my feet, I felt this odd little pang, like I didn't want the night to end just yet. Crazy, right? I glanced at Henry, still sitting there, hands folded in his lap, and for a split second, I wondered if he felt it too, but I pushed it down, deep as I could, and followed Robert up the stairs. "Good night, Henry," I called over my shoulder, keeping my voice steady. He murmured something back, low and soft, and I didn't dare look. Upstairs, I slipped into my nightgown and climbed into bed beside Robert. He was out like a light in minutes, his breathing slow and even, but I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of the settling wood, but my mind wouldn't hush. Henry's face kept drifting in. Those eyes, that calm way he had about him. It wasn't like me to fuss over nothing, but this wasn't nothing. I rolled over, tugging the quilt up to my chin, and told myself it was just a long day playing tricks. "Get some sleep, Diana," I whispered into the dark. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, restless as a leaf in the wind, and every time I closed my eyes, there he was. Henry, steady and quiet, like he'd taken up a corner of my thoughts I didn't know was empty. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I was just tired, worn out from keeping the house, chasing after the kids, keeping everything together. Robert and I had our routine, solid as the hills outside, and Henry was just a visitor, passing through like always. But that feeling wouldn't let go. It sat there, small but growing, like a seed buried in the dirt, waiting for rain. I didn't know what it was yet, didn't want to know, if I'm honest. But it was there all the same, whispering to me in the dark, and I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, something I wasn't ready to name. Downstairs, I pictured Henry by the fire, alone with his thoughts. Did he feel it too, that strange pull? Or was it all in my head? Some silly notion I'd laugh at come morning. I didn't have answers, and that scared me a little. I'd always been the sensible one, kept my feet on the ground, my heart in check. But that night, lying there beside my sleeping husband, I felt the edges of something new, something I couldn't quite see. It was faint, like a breeze you feel before you hear it, but it was enough to keep me awake, wondering what in the world had gotten into me. Morning came after that restless night, and I dragged myself out of bed with the sun barely peeking over the Tennessee hills. Robert was already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, flipping through the paper. I put on my best smile, poured myself a cup, and tried to act like everything was normal. "Sleep okay?" he asked, glancing up. "Oh, fine enough," I lied, stirring sugar into my coffee. The kids tumbled downstairs, all noise and energy, and I busied myself with breakfast. Eggs, toast, a little routine to keep my hands moving and my mind off Henry, but he was there, wasn't he? Henry came down a bit later, his hair still damp from a shower, and settled at the table with a quiet "mornin'." I nodded back, keeping my eyes on the skillet, but I could feel him across the room. It was like he'd brought something with him, an air I couldn't ignore. Robert chatted about his day at the hardware store. The kids bickered over the last piece of bacon, and I kept my head down, pretending I wasn't noticing Henry's every move. But I was. The way he held his mug, the soft grunt he made when he stretched. Little things that stuck with me more than they should have. Robert headed out after breakfast, off to open the store, and the kids grabbed their backpacks and bolted for the school bus. The house went still, just me and Henry left behind. I stood at the sink, washing dishes, the hot water stinging my hands, and told myself to get a grip. "He's just Robert's dad," I muttered under my breath. Nothing more. But the quiet wasn't helping. I could hear Henry moving around, his boots on the hardwood, the creak of the recliner as he sat down, and it was like the walls were closing in, pushing us closer than I wanted. I tried to keep busy, folded laundry, swept the porch, anything to drown out that nagging pull, but every so often I'd catch a glimpse of him, out the window as he stepped outside to check the mailbox, or through the doorway when he passed by with a glass of water. And every time he'd look back, his eyes catching mine for just a second too long. It wasn't bold or flashy, just steady, like he was waiting for something. My heart would jump, and I'd turn away quick, cheeks warm, scolding myself for acting like some fool schoolgirl. The day dragged on like that, a slow dance of avoiding and noticing all at once. I'd hear him humming an old tune in the living room, or the rustle of the newspaper as he turned a page, and it'd pull me right back. By afternoon, I was out in the yard, raking leaves to clear my head. The breeze was cool, the hills stretching out golden and brown, but my thoughts kept circling to Henry. Why was he sticking around longer than usual? He'd said something about a break from work, but it felt off, like there was more he wasn't saying. Supper came around, and we sat down again. Robert back from the store, the kids chattering about school. Henry was there, same spot at the table, and I tried to focus on cutting my chicken, laughing at Robert's stories. But it was like Henry's presence was a magnet, pulling my attention no matter how hard I fought it. After the kids went to bed, we ended up in the living room again. Robert flipped on the TV, some old western flickering across the screen, and I curled up on the couch with a blanket. Henry sat in the armchair, quiet as always, but I could feel his eyes on me like a soft weight I couldn't shake. I tried not to look, kept my gaze on the TV, but it was no use. Every time I glanced over, there he was, watching me with that calm, steady look. It wasn't pushy or loud, just there, tugging at me. My hands fidgeted with the blanket, my mind racing. "What's wrong with you, Diana?" I thought. "This is crazy." But crazy or not, it was real, and it was growing, slow and steady, like a river carving its way through stone. Later that night, after Robert turned in, I stayed up, claiming I needed to finish some knitting. Truth was, I couldn't sleep, not with Henry still downstairs, not with that feeling buzzing under my skin. I sat on the couch, needles clicking, but my eyes kept drifting to the stairs. I heard him moving down there, soft steps, the clink of a glass, and my chest tightened. Part of me wanted to go down, just to see, just to know. But I stayed put, telling myself it was nothing, that I'd wake up tomorrow and it'd all be gone. It didn't go away. The next day was more of the same. Robert off to work, kids at school, me and Henry alone in that big, quiet house. I was in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot, when he came in. He didn't say much at first, just leaned against the counter, watching me. I could feel his gaze like a warm hand on my back, and my scrubbing slowed. "Need anything?" I asked, keeping my voice light, my eyes on the sink. "Just a glass of water," he said, low and easy, but he didn't move to get it. He just stood there, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his soap, clean, simple, him. I turned to grab a glass, my hands shaky, and when I handed it to him, our fingers brushed. It was nothing, just a second. But it hit me like a jolt, warm and sharp all at once. I pulled back quick, turning to the sink, but I could feel him still there, watching. "Thanks, Diana," he said, and there was something in his voice, a little hitch maybe, that made me freeze. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and he lingered a moment longer before walking out. My heart was pounding, loud enough I swore he could hear it, and I gripped the edge of the sink to steady myself. That evening, it all came to a head. Robert was in the living room talking about some order mix-up at the store, and the kids were asleep. Henry and I were there too, me on the couch, him in that darn armchair, and the air felt thick, thicker than it had been before. I tried to focus on Robert, nodding at the right spots, but Henry's presence was everywhere. I could feel it in every breath, every heartbeat, pulling me like a tide I couldn't fight. Then it happened. Robert stepped out to take a call, leaving us alone. The room went quiet, just the crackle of the fire and the hum of the TV. I didn't dare look at Henry, but I knew he was looking at me. I could feel it, heavy and sure. "Diana," he said, soft as a whisper, and I flinched, my head snapping up. He was closer now, standing by the couch, his eyes locked on mine. They were deep, full of something I couldn't name, something that made my breath catch and my hands tremble. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. We just stood there, staring, the space between us shrinking without either of us moving a step. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just in my head. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was growing. Too big to ignore, too strong to push away. Henry didn't say another word, just held my gaze, and I felt it all. The pull, the fear, the want, crashing together like a storm rolling in. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing. This wasn't going away, and neither was I. That moment in the living room with Henry lingered like smoke after a fire. Hazy, heavy, impossible to wave away. Robert came back from his call, oblivious as ever, and the night rolled on like nothing had happened. But something had. I felt it in my bones, in the way my hands wouldn't stop trembling as I cleared the coffee cups. Henry didn't say another word, just sat back down in that armchair, but his eyes followed me, steady and sure, like he knew I'd felt it too. I climbed into bed that night beside Robert, his snores filling the dark, and tried to push it all down, deep where it couldn't reach me. But it clawed its way back, keeping me awake, whispering things I didn't want to hear. Days blurred together after that, each one piling on more weight. Henry stayed longer than he'd planned, said something about a job delay up in Kentucky, and Robert didn't bat an eye. "Good to have you around, Dad," he'd say, clapping Henry on the shoulder. I'd nod along, smiling like everything was fine, but inside I was a mess. Every time Henry was near, it was like the air got thick, hard to breathe, hard to think. I'd catch him watching me over breakfast or out in the yard when I hung the wash, and it'd send a shiver right through me. Not cold, though warm, too warm, like standing too close to a stove. I fought it, Lord knows I did. I'd throw myself into chores, scrubbing floors, baking pies, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind off him, but it was no use. I'd hear his voice, low and easy, talking to Robert about cars or the weather, and it'd pull me right back. I'd see him out the window, raking leaves with the kids, and my heart would skip. Silly, foolish skips I hadn't felt in years. "You're losing your mind, Diana," I'd mutter, shaking my head. But losing it or not, it was there, growing stronger every day, and I didn't know how to stop it. One afternoon, the house was empty. Robert at the store, kids at a friend's. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for biscuits, flour dusting my apron, when Henry walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there by the door, hands in his pockets. I kept my eyes on the dough, pressing harder than I needed to, but I could feel him, his quiet, his stillness, like a pull I couldn't ignore. "Need something?" I asked, voice tight, not looking up. "Just watching," he said, soft as a breeze, and my hands froze mid-knead. I turned, slow, and there he was, closer now, leaning against the counter, eyes locked on mine. They weren't just calm anymore. They were deep, burning with something that made my breath hitch. "Henry, don't!" I started, but the words stuck, weak and shaky. He stepped closer, just one step, but it shrank the room to nothing. "Diana," he said, low and steady, "you feel it too, don't you?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but nothing came out, because he wasn't wrong. I did feel it, every bit of it, and it scared me to death. We stood there, inches apart, the silence roaring louder than the words. My heart pounded, loud enough I swore he could hear it, and I saw it in his eyes too, that same fear, that same want. Then, like a dam breaking, he reached out, his hand brushing my arm. It was light, barely a touch, but it lit me up like a spark on dry grass. I didn't pull away, couldn't, and before I knew it, his hand slid to my cheek, warm and rough from years of work. I leaned into it just a little, and that was it. The walls I'd built, the rules I'd lived by, they crumbled right there in that kitchen. Our lips met, soft at first, tentative, like we were testing the water. But then it turned, fierce, hungry, like we'd been starving for it. His arms pulled me close, and I let him, my hands clutching his shirt, flour smudging the fabric. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a flood, washing away everything I'd told myself I shouldn't feel. I knew it was wrong, Lord, I knew, but I couldn't stop. The taste of him, the heat of him, it drowned out the guilt, the fear, everything but that moment. We broke apart, breathless, and I saw my own shock mirrored in his eyes. "Diana," he whispered, voice rough, "we shouldn't." But I didn't let him finish. I pulled him back, kissing him again, harder this time, like I could chase away the doubts if I just held on tight enough. The kitchen faded, the sink, the dough, the world outside, until it was just us, tangled up in something we couldn't take back. Days after that first kiss, we couldn't stay away. It was like a fever, burning hotter every time we were alone. Stolen moments in the hallway, a brush of hands when Robert wasn't looking. It fed the fire till it was roaring. One evening, the house was quiet again. Robert at a late shift. Kids asleep. I was in the living room folding laundry when Henry came down the stairs. He didn't say a word, just walked over, took the shirt from my hands and set it aside. His eyes were dark, full of that same need I felt, and I didn't resist when he pulled me to him. We stumbled down the hall, lips locked, hands fumbling, till we reached the guest room, his room. The door clicked shut, and it was like the last thread of restraint snapped. He pressed me against the wall, kissing me deep and desperate, and I gave in completely. My fingers tugged at his shirt, his hands slid under mine, and we shed everything, clothes, guilt, sense, like it didn't matter anymore. He lifted me, gentle but sure, and carried me to the bed, laying me down like I was something precious. His eyes burned into mine, asking without words, and I nodded, pulling him close. What happened next wasn't just bodies, it was souls crashing together, raw and real. Every touch, every kiss lit me up till I couldn't think straight. He was tender, but there was a strength there too, a need that matched mine. We moved together, lost in it, the world shrinking to that room, that bed, that moment. It built and built, a wave crashing over us, and when it broke, it was like fireworks, bright, blinding, leaving nothing but the dark behind. I felt him tense, heard his breath catch, and we hit that peak together, clinging to each other like it was all we had left. When it was over, we lay there, side by side, breathing hard. The air was thick with what we'd done, but it wasn't awkward, just quiet, heavy with something new. I turned to him, tracing his face with my fingers, feeling the lines etched by time. His eyes met mine, soft now, but full of more than just passion, a tie that had bound us tighter than I'd ever meant it to. "We can't hide this," I whispered, my voice barely there. He nodded, slow, like he'd known it all along. "I don't want to," he said, and those words sank into me, solid and true. We stayed there a while, tangled in the sheets, the house silent around us. I knew what we'd done couldn't stay secret forever, knew it'd change everything. But in that moment, it didn't matter. We were together, and that was enough. The guilt would come later, I reckon, but right then, it was just us. Two flames that had merged into one, burning bright and fierce, no matter what lay ahead. After that night in the guest room, everything shifted, quiet, slow, like the world holding its breath before a storm. Henry and I didn't talk much about what we'd done, but it hung between us, thick and real. We'd crossed a line, Lord knows we had, and there was no undoing it. Mornings came like always. Robert up early, sipping coffee, the kids tumbling downstairs, me at the stove flipping pancakes. I'd catch Henry's eye across the table and we'd share a look, quick, secret, loaded with everything we couldn't say. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it felt like ours, and that kept me holding on. Days turned into weeks, and Henry didn't leave. He'd mumble something about work in Kentucky being slow, and Robert just shrugged, happy to have his dad around. "Stay as long as you like," he'd say, clapping Henry on the back. I'd nod, smile, play the part, but inside, I was walking a tightrope. Every touch from Henry, a brush of his hand when we passed in the hall, a squeeze under the table, lit me up and tore me apart all at once. Guilt gnawed at me, sharp and cold, but the pull was stronger. I'd lie awake beside Robert, his steady breathing a reminder of what I was risking, and still, I couldn't let Henry go. We got bolder, too bold. A kiss in the pantry when Robert was out front, a whispered word when the kids weren't looking. It was like playing with fire, knowing full well it'd burn us someday. And it did. Henry's birthday rolled around, a quiet little thing we'd planned. Just the three of us, a cake, maybe some cards. I got it in my head to do something special for him, something reckless. I'd slipped into town earlier that week, bought a silky scarf, deep red, soft as a whisper, and tucked it away with a note. "Meet me after supper." It was foolish, but I wanted him to know how deep this ran, how much I couldn't shake him. That night, we sat around the table, Robert laughing, cutting the cake, Henry smiling that soft smile of his. I'd tied the scarf around my neck, casual-like, but Henry's eyes flickered when he saw it, a spark only I could read. Everything felt normal on the surface, Robert telling stories about the store, me passing plates, but underneath, it was electric. I could feel Henry across from me, every glance a secret thread tying us tighter. The kids had gone to bed early, worn out from school, and it was just us three, the fire crackling low. Then it all fell apart. Robert remembered some papers he'd stashed in Henry's bag. Order forms for the store, he said. Be right back, he muttered, heading to the hall. I didn't think much of it. Just kept clearing the table, my mind on Henry and that note I'd slipped him. But when Robert came back, he was too quiet, too still. His face was hard, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. I've got to step out, he said, voice flat, grabbing his keys. Work thing. Won't be long. He kissed my cheek, quick, cold, and was gone before I could ask. My stomach dropped, but I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks. Henry and I were alone now, the house silent except for the wind rattling the windows. I looked at him, saw the same unease in his eyes, but neither of us spoke it. Guess it's just us, I said, trying to keep it light. He nodded, slow, and stood up. I untied the scarf, letting it drape over my shoulders, and his gaze followed it, dark and heavy. We didn't need words, we knew. I followed him down the hall, my heart pounding, till we reached the guest room again. The door shut, and it was like the world outside vanished. His hands were on me, pulling me close, and I gave in, kissing him hard, letting that fire take over. The scarf slipped to the floor, forgotten, as we sank into each other, desperate and sure. We didn't hear the truck pull back up, didn't hear the front door creak. We were lost in it. Lips, hands, the heat of it all, when the guest room door flew open. Robert stood there, his shadow filling the frame, his face a storm of rage and hurt. I froze, breath caught, as Henry stumbled back, shirt half undone. What the hell is this? Robert roared, voice low and deadly. I yanked the sheet up, words tangling in my throat, but there was no explaining this away. He'd seen it all, me, Henry, the truth laid bare. You! Robert lunged at Henry, fists flying before I could move. You're my father! He shouted, each word cracking with pain. Henry threw up his arms, blocking the blows, but he didn't fight back, not really. Robert, stop! I cried, scrambling off the bed, but he turned on me, eyes blazing. And you, he snarled, my wife. The betrayal in his voice cut deeper than any fist could. I reached for him, pleading, but he shoved past, slamming Henry against the wall. How could you? He yelled, tears mixing with the fury. It was chaos, shouting, shoving, the room spinning around us. Henry took the hits, his face tight, but I could see he wouldn't hurt his son, not more than he already had. Finally, Robert stepped back, chest heaving, and pointed at the door. Get out, he said, voice cold as ice. Both of you, I don't ever want to see you again. I opened my mouth to beg, to explain, but his glare stopped me dead. Now, he snapped, and there was no arguing with that. We didn't say a word as we grabbed what we could, my coat, Henry's bag, a handful of clothes stuffed in a hurry. The house felt like a stranger's as we stumbled out into the night, the hills looming dark and silent. Robert's truck was still in the drive, lights off, and I could feel his eyes on us through the window, boring holes into my back. Henry started his old pickup, the engine rumbling low, and I climbed in, numb. We drove off, the headlights cutting through the dark, leaving behind everything I'd known, my home, my family, my life. The silence between us was heavy, choking. Henry gripped the wheel, knuckles white, his jaw set hard. I stared out the window, the trees blurring past, and felt the weight of it all settle in. What had we done? What had I let happen? The man beside me wasn't just Henry anymore. He was the match that had lit the fuse, and now everything was burning. I wanted to say something, to bridge the gap, but the words wouldn't come. We'd wanted each other, sure, but this was the cost, and it was more than I'd ever bargained for. We pulled into a motel an hour later, some run-down place off the highway, flickering neon, chipped paint, the kind of spot you pass without a second thought. Henry got us a room, his voice flat as he handed over cash, and we shuffled inside. The bed creaked under us as we sat, miles apart even in that tiny space. I looked at him, searching for something, regret maybe, or hope, but his face was blank, closed off. "What now?" I whispered, barely audible. He didn't answer, just stared at the wall, and I knew then that whatever we'd had, it was cracking under the weight of what we'd lost. That motel room felt like a tomb, cold, grey, and silent as the grave. Henry and I sat there that first night, the hum of the highway outside the only sound between us. We'd left everything behind, our home, Robert, the kids, and it hung over us like a weight we couldn't shake. I kept waiting for him to say something, anything, to bridge the gap, but he just stared at the peeling wallpaper, hands clasped tight in his lap. I wanted to reach out, to hold on to what we'd had, but it was slipping through my fingers, fast and final. The next morning, we barely spoke. I brewed coffee in the little machine by the sink, the bitter smell filling the room, and handed him a cup. "Thanks," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. We sat on opposite sides of the bed, sipping in silence, and I felt the distance growing, wider, colder, like a river carving a canyon. What we'd done had bound us together, sure, but now it was tearing us apart piece by piece. I wanted to ask what he was thinking, if he regretted it, but the words stuck in my throat. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Days dragged on like that, a blur of beige walls and stale air. Henry started leaving, short trips at first, saying he had things to check on, but he'd come back quiet, withdrawn. I'd sit there alone, the TV flickering with some old sitcom I didn't watch, and try to make sense of it all. The fire we'd felt, that wild, reckless pull, it was fading, replaced by something heavy and hollow. I'd catch myself staring at the door, hoping he'd walk in and be the Henry I'd fallen for, but each time he was a little more gone. One night he didn't come back till late, smelling of gasoline and frost. "Where have you been?" I asked, voice small. He shrugged, tossing his keys on the dresser. "Out," was all he said, and that was it. The wall between us grew taller. I lay awake that night, listening to his breathing across the bed, and realized we weren't in this together anymore. We'd built something on stolen moments, but out here, in the harsh light of what we'd done, it was crumbling. Then the divorce papers came. A knock on the motel door one grey afternoon, a man in a stiff suit handing me an envelope. I tore it open, hands shaking, and there it was. Robert's name, my name, the end of us in black and white. Tucked inside was a note, his handwriting sharp and angry. "You're dead to me, Diana. I don't want to see you or him ever again. We're done. Forget I existed." Each word hit like a punch, knocking the air out of me. I sank onto the bed, the paper crumpling in my hands, and felt something break, something deep and final. Robert was gone, really gone, and I'd made it happen. Henry found me like that, staring at the note, tears streaking my face. "What's that?" he asked, voice flat. I held it out, wordless, and he read it slow, his jaw tightening. "He means it," he said, handing it back, and that was all. No comfort, no fight. I looked at him, searching for the man who'd held me like I was everything, but he was a stranger now, eyes dull and distant. "What do we do?" I whispered, desperate for a tether. He didn't answer, just turned away, and I knew then we were sinking, and he wasn't reaching for me. A few days later, he left for good. I woke up to an empty room, the bed cold where he'd been. On the table was a note, scribbled fast. "Diana, I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. Our paths split here, it's over. Goodbye, Henry." I read it once, twice, 3 times, the words blurring through tears. He'd walked out, left me with nothing but a few lines on a motel napkin. I sat there, the silence pressing in, and felt the last thread snap. Henry was gone, Robert was gone, and I was alone. Truly, achingly alone. I stayed in that room a while longer, living like a ghost, the walls closed in, the air thick with regret. I'd pace the floor, replaying it all. Robert's rage, Henry's hands, the life I'd torched with my own choices. Sleep came in fits, dreams of Robert's face twisted with hurt, Henry walking away into the dark. I'd wake up gasping, clutching the sheets, the emptiness swallowing me whole. Outside, the world moved on, cars rumbling by, folks laughing somewhere far off. But I was stuck, trapped in the wreckage I'd made. One morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed what little I had, clothes, a toothbrush, that crumpled note from Henry, and checked out. The clerk barely looked up as I slid the key across the counter, and I stepped into the daylight, blinking against the glare. I didn't know where to go, just walked, down the highway, past gas stations and diners, till I found a bus stop. I caught a ride into town, staring out the window as the hills rolled by, and ended up at a cheap apartment on the edge of nowhere. Peeling paint, a sagging couch, a place to hide. I moved in, set up what I could, but it wasn't home. It was a shell, like me, empty, worn, holding on to nothing. I'd sit on that couch for hours, the TV droning, and feel the weight of it all. Robert's note echoed in my head, "Forget I existed," and Henry's goodbye cut just as deep. I'd lost them both, lost everything, and the loneliness was a cold, endless thing. I'd try to eat, to sleep, to live, but it was like moving through fog, thick grey, no way out. Days turned to weeks, and I sank lower. I'd walk to the corner store sometimes just to feel the air, but even that was hollow. People passed by, chatting, living, and I felt like a shadow, there but not there. I'd think about the kids, wonder what Robert told them, and the guilt would twist sharper. I'd ruined their world too, hadn't I? The thought of it, of them hating me, of Robert erasing me, kept me up nights, staring at the ceiling, drowning in what I couldn't fix. One evening, sitting on that lumpy couch, I broke. The tears came hard, hot, choking sobs that shook me till I couldn't breathe. I hugged my knees, rocking back and forth, and let it all out. The pain, the shame, the loss. It didn't fix anything, didn't lighten the load, but it was all I had left. I was alone, stripped bare, and I didn't know how to climb out of the hole I'd dug. That little apartment felt like a cave, dim, cramped and cold as a winter night. I'd sit there day after day, the walls staring back, and wonder how I'd ended up so far from the life I'd known. Robert was gone, Henry too, and the silence was deafening. I'd lost my family, my home, everything that had made me me, and the weight of it pinned me down like a stone. Mornings came grey and slow, the light creeping through the blinds, but I'd just lie there, staring at nothing, the ache in my chest a constant companion. I tried to keep going, made coffee, washed a dish or two, but it was like moving through mud. The world outside kept turning, folks heading to work, kids laughing somewhere distant, but I was stuck, replaying it all. Robert's face when he found us, Henry's note on that motel table, it looped in my head, sharp and relentless. I'd sit on that sagging couch, holding a cup till it went cold, and ask myself over and over, how did I let it get this far? There were no answers, just echoes of my own mistakes. One night, it hit me harder than usual. I was flipping through an old photo album I'd grabbed in the rush. Pictures of the kids, Robert smiling on the porch, happier days. And the tears came like a flood. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, and sobbed till my throat burned. It wasn't just sadness, it was shame, regret, a whole mess of things I couldn't name. I'd betrayed Robert, lost Henry, and left my kids without a mother worth a darn. That night, I hit bottom, and I knew I couldn't keep living like this, half alive, drowning in what I'd done. The next morning, something shifted, just a flicker, but enough. I wiped my eyes, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the tiny kitchen table with a phone book. I flipped to the yellow pages, found a counselor's number, and dialed before I could talk myself out of it. "I need help," I said when she answered, voice shaky but sure. We set a time, and I hung up, feeling a sliver of light break through the fog. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Those first sessions were rough. Sitting across from that kind woman, Dr. Ellis, she called herself, I'd stumble over my words, the shame choking me up. "I ruined everything," I'd say, tears spilling again. She'd listen, patient as a saint, and nudge me along. "You can't change it, Diana," she'd tell me, soft but firm, "but you can learn to carry it." Slowly, I opened up, about Henry, Robert, the kids, the whole tangled mess. She didn't judge, just helped me untie the knots one by one. It took time, weeks, months, but I started to see it different. Dr. Ellis showed me my past didn't have to own me. "You made a mistake," she said one day. "A big one, sure, but it's not the end of you." That stuck. I'd lost so much, but I was still here, breathing, living, with a chance to make something new. Forgiving myself wasn't easy. Some days I'd backslide, the guilt clawing back, but I kept at it, step by slow step. I found a job eventually, pouring coffee at a little diner down the road. It wasn't much, greasy counters, chipped mugs, but it got me out, gave me something to do. The regulars would nod, call me Hon, and I'd smile, pouring refills, feeling a bit more human each time. The smell of bacon frying, the clink of plates, it was simple, steady, a rhythm I could lean on. I'd catch myself humming sometimes, old hymns my mama used to sing, and it'd lift me just enough to keep going. The pain didn't vanish, Lord no, but it softened, like a bruise fading over time. I'd walk home after a shift, the Tennessee hills glowing gold in the evening light, and feel a quiet settle in, not peace exactly, but close. I started noticing things again, the way the wind rustled the leaves, the chirp of crickets at dusk, and they'd bring a small comfort, a reminder I wasn't all used up. Nights got easier too. I'd sit with a cup of tea, maybe read a bit, and sleep came without so many ghosts. One day, sitting in that diner on a slow afternoon, I realized I was healing. Not fast, not perfect, but real. I'd lost everything, Robert's trust, Henry's closeness, my kids' innocence, but I hadn't lost me, not completely. Dr. Ellis was right. I could carry it, learn from it, even if it'd always be part of me. I started looking ahead, not just back, small plans, like planting a flower box or saving for a better place. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, and that mattered. Looking back now, I see it clear. I chased a feeling, wild, fierce and wrong, and it cost me dear. I hurt Robert, broke my family, lost Henry in the end. If I could turn time, I'd hold tight to what I had. My marriage, my home, the love I took for granted. Passion's a powerful thing, like a river in flood. It'll sweep you away if you don't watch your step. I learned that the hard way, and I'm still piecing myself back together because of it. But here's what I'd tell you, friends. Cherish what's yours. Don't let a spark blind you to the good you've already got. Mistakes happen. We're human after all. But they don't have to define you forever. I made mine, paid a steep price, and I'm still here, finding my way. Maybe that's the lesson. Life goes on even when you think it won't, and you've got to keep walking one day at a time. That's my story wrapped up, folks, from the spark to the fall and the slow climb back. It's been a journey, hasn't it? I lost a lot, but I found something too, a chance to start over, bruised but breathing. Thanks for sitting with me through all this on Diana's Diaries. What's your take? Ever had to pick yourself up like that? Share below. I'd love to hear your heart. Till next time, take care.